In 1963, President Kennedy issued a report finding widespread discrimination against women in the workplace.
It was an historic occasion, the passage of the Civil Rights Bill.
The next year, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. Title VII of the Act barred unequal treatment on the basis of race or religion. In a surprise, last-minute move, Congress included a ban on gender discrimination as well. Few took the provision on gender seriously. Even the director of the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, the new agency created to enforce the law, called it a fluke. Eileen Hernandez, who had risen through the ranks of the labor movement, was the only woman on the commission.
Some of our commissioners were not taking action because essentially they were dealing with the race issues that they were familiar with. The first case that I remember that we really had a big discussion about sex discrimination was the airlines.
We were the first jet setters. Walking down the street in your uniform, you could turn ahead. People would go, I heard that airlines were having an interview in town. It was in a motel, and he would call them in one at a time. And it was my turn to go into the bedroom, and the first thing he said was hold up your skirt. And I said, excuse me? And he said, let me see your legs.
An important part of this crew is the smiling stewardess. To qualify on most airlines, she must be single and between the ages of 21 and 28. She must be between 5 feet 2 and 5 feet 6 inches in height and of normal weight.
They taught us how to put makeup on and how to do our hair, how to squat down so you didn't show anything if you're going to be in the aisle and you had to kneel down.
They would give us girdle checks. You had to wear girdles. Everything was checked. Uniform clean, makeup good, everything right down the aisle. It was almost like open your mouth, let me check your teeth like a horse.
When I started flying, I was 26 at the time. I thought, oh man, I could make a whole career out of this. And then I realized that I can't. They're going to fire me when I'm 32 years old.
In 1953, anyone who was hired after that date was fired at age 32. That was it. They came on the airplane with the bundle of roses and said goodbye.
I was called into the supervisor's office, and she said, well, happy birthday. I said, thank you very much. She said, you know what that means, don't you? At 32, I was too old to be out in public anymore. You should be home married and having children. You shouldn't be on the airplane. Leave that up to the young pretty girls.
Furious, the stewardesses marched to Washington to file a claim with the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission.
We were the first case. We went down July 1st, 1965. The EOC in Washington walked in. They hadn't even unpacked the typewriter.
The EEOC expected mainly black people coming in, and to see two white women coming in there saying I'm just being discriminated against because of my age, that was just kind of peculiar.
We're getting complaints from every place at this point in time on the issue of race. Nobody had done anything on the issue of discrimination against women, and they suddenly had to do something.
But in fact, the EEOC did nothing. Under pressure from the airlines, they refused to act.
I quit. I quit because we were not moving on any of these cases. I had learned a long time ago that if you do your best to get something done, and if it's not moving, you don't stay there and keep waiting for it to move. You go out somewhere and start pushing them to move.
Eileen Hernandez joined a small group of female lawyers and politicians who had watched and waited in vain for the EEOC to act.
These women were extremely frustrated when they discovered that they could not push the ELC to go further. They had this very exciting meeting at which they decided we're going to go outside the bounds of the structure. We're going to form our own organization.
Betty Friedan came up with the name National Organization for Women. She and two other people worked on the declaration, and they finally have an organization.
The National Organization for Women, or NOW, invited Betty Friedan to be its first president.
What is it you're trying to do? Well, we are really trying to do something about, for instance, the conditions that prevent women from easily combining marriage and motherhood and work in the professions.
Like the NAACP, NOW chose a legal strategy, looking for test cases they could use to challenge discriminatory laws. They focused on an obscure case wending its way through the Georgia courts in the fall of 1967. Lorena Weeks was a telephone operator in Watley, Georgia, struggling to get by with 3 children. She sued Southern Bell because they had blocked her advancement in the company.
I worked because I had to. I didn't have any other choice. There were just a lot of jobs that women were not allowed to do. Cable repairman, a test deskman, a tow test, a switchman. It just goes on and on and on. But I was always looking. If there was any way any one of those jobs came open, I would want it because it meant so much more money.
When an opening for switchman came up, Weeks applied. By Southern Bell's own seniority rules, the job should have been hers.
It was maintaining the equipment within the central office. And it just as easy as it could be and just so much fun.
Weeks' application was turned down. She was told by her superior that the job was reserved for men.
He says, Lorena, I have nothing against you, but you know, if you win this position, we'll have to give it to other women. I said, well, that's exactly what this is all about. He said, well, you know, the man's the breadwinner in the family. I said, oh no. When I go through the grocery line in the grocery store, they don't push back a loaf of bread and say, you a nice little lady, you can have this 10 cents cheaper just because I'm a woman.
Weeks sued Southern Bell. In court, the company successfully argued that they were merely protecting women from having to lift equipment weighing as much as 30 pounds.
Most any woman, if they ever held a baby, they could lift 30 pounds. It wasn't a protective thing to keep women out of these jobs. It was keeping them away from making more money.
The National Organization for Women provided a young lawyer, Sylvia Roberts, to handle Weeks' appeal. During the trial, Roberts arranged for several objects weighing more than 30 pounds to be brought into the courtroom.
These pieces of equipment were supposed to be beyond Lorena's capability, and I lifted all of those, and I pointed out that I wasn't even an average-sized woman.
Sylvia was a tiny little woman. She didn't weigh 100 pounds. She was little thing.
Even after Roberts' demonstration, the case dragged on for nearly 2 years, but Weeks refused to give up.
Why to fight so hard? Because I knew, like myself and my mother, how hard you had to work to make a living. A lone woman has to work and pay debts just like the man does.
Finally, in March 1969, a federal appeals court ruled in Weeks' favor, stating that Title VII rejects this type of romantic paternalism. The promise of Title VII is that women are now to be on equal footing.
Weeks' case gave momentum to NOW because it showed that we as women could use the system, that we could achieve this equality under the law. It wasn't fanciful, it wasn't a pie in the sky. It could be done, and we did it.
From the Weeks case, NOW moved on to other important victories, including the end of segregated help wanted ads and male-only clubs and restaurants. But the organization and the movement itself were limited, concerned largely with the travails of white middle-class women.
Black women were initially perplexed about how they should respond to the women's movement. Its first face was a white face. They associated white women with white men and white privilege. How are we to respond?
I think feminism was perceived to be white women's work, not Black women's work. And I think feminism was perceived to be something that you needed to stay away from because it wasn't going to help African American community.
For most Black women, the preoccupations of middle-class white women seemed a world away.
Here we were, we who were Black women, unable to raise our families if two people didn't get out and work. And what you have among white people are women who have the leisure to sit at home. What do we have in common with those people?
For years, Black women had been lending their energy to the civil rights movement, excelling as organizers and occasionally assuming highly public leadership roles.
Now is the time to be aware of what's going on in the state of Mississippi.
I remember the day that I realized that I could be a principal in my own life. And that was really a revolutionary thought.
Many college-age white women flocked south to join the struggle, where they were inspired by the example of their Black sisters.
My first employment in the civil rights movement had me working for a Black woman. She was not only the first Black woman I'd ever had as boss, she was the first woman I'd ever had as a boss. It was the beginning of my own emancipation.
Radicalized by their experiences in civil rights, these younger women began to look at their own lives differently.
We were talking about freedom and equality, and some of the women who were in the civil rights movement started applying principles to themselves as women.
Women could not fail but make the comparison with race and understand that just as there needed to be a racial liberation movement, there needed to be a women's liberation movement. Whenever one person stands up and says, wait a minute, this is wrong, it helps other people to do the same.
The civil rights and anti-war movements not only inspired younger women, but also exposed them to deep sexism, even within their own ranks.
My experience in those movements was suddenly one of discovering that I was a natural leader, and yet men were not letting me and other women rise as natural leaders.
A woman and her man would come home from demonstrations exhausted from being beat up by cops or being busted or whatever, and he would lie down on the sofa and wipe the tear gas out of his eyes and say, wow, it was really hard. And she'd say, yeah, and wipe the tear gas out of her eyes and go and make dinner. The bad behavior by guys in the left was particularly heartbreaking to us because we were young, idealistic women thinking we were making the revolution together. Out of that context, the first autonomous radical feminist groups began to form.
There was a campus meeting of Students for a Democratic Society, and I was talking before the group, and one of the guys in the group said, shut up. And I finished speaking, and then went around the room and tapped all the women on the shoulder, who were probably over 50% of the people there, and said, let's leave and go upstairs and talk on our own.
These women were angry, and they were organized from having been in other movements. They were disciplined, and they knew how to create a movement. They had done it. They'd done it with men. Now they could do it for themselves.
All over America, pretty much spontaneously almost, in college communities and big cities, these groups would develop. And what came out of it was similar problems, similar ways of being treated by the world, and often similar desires.
These